The cake box trembled in my arthritic hands as I stood frozen in the doorway, rainwater pooling at my feet. 9 hours I had driven through that merciless storm, my 78-year-old knees screaming with every mile, all to surprise my daughter on her 50th birthday. But the words I heard from the kitchen cut deeper than any physical pain I had ever endured. God, I hope she crashes and dies. Then we wouldn't have to deal with her constant phone calls anymore. My name is Evangeline Evie Harrington, and at 78, I thought I understood heartbreak. I buried my beloved husband Jasper 12 years ago, survived breast cancer 3 years later, and spent countless nights in this empty colonial house on Elm Street, talking to his photograph, just to hear a voice in the darkness. But nothing, not death, not disease, not the crushing weight of loneliness, had prepared me for the moment when my only child, my daughter Vivienne, wished me dead. I had risen before dawn that Tuesday morning, my fingers stiff and uncooperating as I carefully arranged butter on the kitchen counter to soften. The 3-layer carrot cake was going to be perfect. It had to be. Vivian had loved carrot cake since she was 7 years old, declaring at her birthday party that chocolate is what everyone expects. Mama, I want to be different. Even now, decades later, I could picture her gap-toothed grin as she made that pronouncement. Cake crumbs scattered across her frilly pink dress. The recipe was my mother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who believed that love could be measured in cups of flour and spoonfuls of cinnamon. I had enhanced it over the years, adding extra spices and a hint of vanilla that Jasper used to steal straight from the bottle when he thought I wasn't watching. My hands worked from memory, grating fresh carrots until my wrist ached, folding in pecans and raisins with the reverence of a sacred ritual. But it was the marzipan carrots that nearly broke me. 24 tiny vegetables, each one shaped by these gnarled fingers that don't bend like they used to. Rolling the orange-tinted marzipan, pinching one end to create that perfect carrot point. Carefully attaching the delicate green stems, each one took nearly 10 minutes. By the time I finished, my hands were cramping, but those little carrots sat arranged in a perfect circle on top of the cream cheese frosting like a miniature garden of hope. "You're driving all that way alone?" my neighbor Beatrice had asked when I told her my plan. She stood on her side of the white picket fence that separated our driveways, pruning shears in hand, silver curls escaping from beneath her wide-brimmed gardening hat. We'd been neighbors for 32 years, ever since she moved in after her messy divorce. She'd watched Vivian grow up, helped me care for Jasper during those final, terrible months when cancer ate him alive from the inside out, and brought me casseroles when my own cancer treatments left me too weak to stand. "It's not like I'm crossing the Oregon Trail, Beatrice," I replied, carefully securing the cake carrier between 2 pillows in my trunk. "I'm taking Interstate 84, not some wagon train through hostile territory." "That's not the point, Evie. The weather report is calling for heavy rain all the way to Connecticut. And your knees, how are they holding up?" I paused, feeling the familiar ache that had become my constant companion since the arthritis really took hold. "My knees and I have reached an understanding," I said with more confidence than I felt. "They complain, and I ignore them." Beatrice sighed in that way she always did when she knew arguing with me was pointless. "At least take your cell phone and promise me you'll call when you get there safely." "Yes, Mother," I teased, though Beatrice was actually 6 months younger than me. "Someone has to look out for you," she muttered, turning back to her prize-winning roses. Ever since Jasper died, you've been too independent for your own good. I left Millfield at 4:30 that morning, my overnight bag packed with my good cardigan, the navy blue one that Vivian had complimented years ago, and the lavender hand cream she used to love borrowing when she was small. The thermos of French roast coffee sat beside me, still steaming, filling my old Honda with the comforting scent of home. I had sprinkled cinnamon on top, just the way Jasper used to make it on Sunday mornings when we'd sit on the back porch and plan our week together. The radio played softly the oldies station that Jasper and I used to dance to in our kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. Elvis was crooning, "Can't Help Falling in Love," as I pulled out of my driveway. And for a moment, I could almost feel Jasper's presence beside me, his hand warm on my knee, encouraging me forward on this journey of maternal devotion. The rain started just outside of Millfield, fat droplets splattering against my windshield like the beginning of some cosmic confession. By the time I reached the Massachusetts state line, it had transformed into a relentless, punishing downpour that reduced visibility to nothing but the red taillights of the car ahead of me. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle, squeaking across the glass in a rhythm that matched the throbbing in my swollen joints. "You should have listened to Beatrice," I said aloud to myself, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel as my fingers began to stiffen. The arthritis was always worse in damp weather, as if my bones could sense every drop of moisture in the air. But I kept driving, because what was a little rain and pain compared to the joy I would see on Vivian's face when I appeared at her door? I pictured it perfectly as the miles stretched ahead, her eyes widening in genuine surprise, her hands flying to her mouth in that unconscious gesture she'd inherited from me. That little girl squeal of delight she still sometimes let escape when she was truly happy. "Mom, what are you doing here?" she would say. And then would come the hug, the real, bone-deep embrace I hadn't felt in longer than I cared to admit. 9 hours stretched before me like a test of will. But I had faced harder challenges. I had driven through blizzards to get Vivian to dance recitals, navigated flooded roads to reach her college graduation, sat in hospital waiting rooms while she had her tonsils removed and her wisdom teeth extracted. A little storm and some arthritis pain weren't going to stop me from celebrating my daughter's milestone birthday. The highway became a river of asphalt disappearing into sheets of rain, and trucks roared past, spraying walls of water that momentarily blinded me. I slowed to 50 miles per hour, then 45, hunched forward over the steering wheel as if those extra few inches might somehow improve my vision. The cake sat secure in its carrier on the passenger seat, my physical manifestation of 50 years of maternal love, wrapped in fondant and crowned with those painstakingly crafted marzipan carrots. This was going to be perfect. It had to be, because somewhere along the way, our relationship had grown formal and distant, filled with careful scheduling and time limitations that I couldn't quite understand. But a surprise visit, a homemade cake, the simple act of showing up unannounced, surely this would cut through all that awkwardness and remind us both of what really mattered. As the rain pounded against my windshield and my arthritic hands gripped the steering wheel with determined strength, I had no idea that I was driving toward the most devastating moment of my 78 years. I had no idea that the surprise I was planning would be nothing compared to the one waiting for me in Vivian's kitchen. I arrived at Vivian's Tudor-style home just after 2 p.m, the rain finally beginning to lighten, as if offering me a moment of clarity before the storm of my life truly began. The subdivision was everything I had expected, Manicured lawns despite the weather, houses standing proud and separate, like monuments to success. Vivienne's home, the largest on the cul-de-sac, glowed warm against the darkening afternoon sky, its windows revealing movement and shadows that I assumed were birthday preparations for a party I hadn't been invited to attend. I parked across the street rather than in their driveway, part of the surprise, I told myself, though now I wonder if some instinct was already warning me to keep an escape route clear, carefully. I lifted the cake carrier, checking one last time that my precious marzipan carrots were intact after their arduous journey. The walk to their front door was only 20 feet, but by the time I reached it, my raincoat was soaked through, cold water trickling down my neck and into my sensible shoes. I didn't ring the bell. The door was unlocked, as it always was when they were expecting birthday company, just not me. I stepped into the marble-floored entryway, water immediately pooling beneath my feet on their pristine surface. The house smelled of rosemary and garlic, something expensive roasting that reminded me of the dinner parties Vivian and her husband Sterling hosted for their friends' gatherings I'd stopped being invited to years ago, though I'd never understood why. Their home was a testament to careful curation and substantial investment. The antique console table in the foyer had cost more than my first car, according to Vivian, who'd mentioned the price with pride during one of our increasingly rare visits. Abstract paintings that she assured me were quite valuable, despite looking like something a child might create, hung on walls painted in sophisticated grays and creams. The carefully arranged family photographs displayed throughout the space somehow managed not to include a single picture of me, a detail I'd noticed before but always dismissed as coincidence. The marble floor gleamed beneath recessed lighting, cool and unwelcoming against my wet footprints. I hesitated in that pristine entryway, suddenly uncertain about my surprise visit. Should I call out and announce myself? The cake felt heavy in my arthritic hands, the weight of 50 years of maternal expectations suddenly more burdensome than its 3 perfect layers. Voices drifted from the kitchen, laughter punctuating whatever conversation flowed between my daughter and her husband. I moved forward slowly, rehearsing my entrance. Surprise seemed too cliché. Happy birthday, sweetheart, felt too saccharine for the woman Vivian had become. Perhaps a simple hello would suffice, followed by the presentation of my love, made manifest in flour and sugar. I was about to round the corner into their gleaming kitchen when I heard my name spoken in a tone that made my blood freeze. Mom called again this morning, Vivian said, her voice carrying that sharp edge I'd noticed creeping into our conversations lately. 3rd time this week. My feet rooted themselves to the polished hardwood floor, my body unable to process the command to retreat that my mind was desperately sending. The cake box grew impossibly heavy in my trembling hands. What did she want this time? Sterling's voice sounded slightly bored, as if discussing an irritating but predictable interruption to their day. Same as always, Vivian replied with an audible sigh. To talk about nothing for an hour, to remind me that she's all alone, to make me feel guilty for living my own life instead of sitting by the phone waiting for her to need something. Each word landed like a physical blow to my chest. This was how my daughter described our conversations, our connection. The phone calls I looked forward to all week, planned for, treasured as my only regular contact with the child I'd raised and loved with every fiber of my being. At least she didn't invite herself for your birthday, Sterling said with what sounded like genuine relief. Remember last year when she stayed for 5 days? I had to hide in our bedroom just to get some peace and quiet. 5 days. I remembered those 5 days differently, helping Vivian reorganize her kitchen, cooking her favorite meals, playing board games in the evenings like we used to when she was small. I'd thought we were bonding, reconnecting. Apparently, I'd been wrong. Don't remind me, Vivian continued, and I could picture her at the kitchen island, probably chopping vegetables for whatever elaborate meal they were preparing for friends who would actually be welcome at this birthday celebration. She mentioned something about maybe visiting soon during our last call. I told her we were busy with work projects. Good thinking, Sterling replied. The last thing we need is her showing up here unannounced. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so devastating. Here I stood, exactly what they'd just declared to be their worst nightmare, holding a cake that had taken me 2 days to perfect after driving 9 hours through a storm that had left my entire body screaming in protest. But then Vivian said something that stopped my heart entirely. God, I hope she crashes. The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable crystallizing into something sharp and deadly that lodged itself in my chest. My daughter, my only child, the baby I'd nursed through countless midnight fevers, the little girl whose scraped knees I'd kissed better, the teenager whose heart I'd helped mend with ice cream and patience had just wished for my death. Then we wouldn't have to deal with her constant phone calls anymore. She continued with a bitter laugh that I didn't recognize, a sound that seemed to come from a stranger wearing my daughter's voice. Sterling's response was even worse than her words. He laughed, not the uncomfortable chuckle of someone caught off guard by a dark joke, but genuine amusement, as if my potential demise was a delightfully entertaining prospect. Or at least get lost somewhere, he added, his voice warm with shared conspiracy. Give us a weekend without the guilt trips and endless neediness. Their laughter mingled together like some hideous harmony, filling the space between us with a cruelty so casual, so practiced, that I realized this wasn't the first time they discussed my death as a solution to their problems. This was a conversation they'd had before, probably many times, refining their mutual resentment of my existence until it had become this polished routine of casual malice. I stood there in their hallway, rainwater still dripping from my coat onto their expensive flooring, holding a cake that suddenly felt like evidence of my own foolishness. The marzipan carrots I'd spent hours crafting seemed to mock me now. Tiny, perfect symbols of love offered to people who found my very existence burdensome. I don't remember making the decision to move. My body simply carried me forward into the kitchen where they stood, exactly as I'd imagined Vivian at the Marble Island with a chef's knife in her hand, Sterling stirring something fragrant on their professional-grade stove. When they saw me, shock drained the color from their faces, their mouths opening in perfect circles of horror as they calculated exactly how much I'd heard and what damage control would be required. Time suspended itself in that moment. I could see the realization dawning in their eyes, the understanding that their carefully constructed facade had just crumbled, that the mother and meal ticket they'd been discussing was standing right there, dripping wet and holding a birthday cake like some pathetic offering to gods who had already decided she was expendable. I watched Vivian's hand rise instinctively to her throat, a gesture she'd inherited from me, something we both did when words failed us completely. But no words came from any of us. The silence stretched and hardened until it became something solid and unbreachable. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't demand explanations or apologies or assurances that I'd misunderstood. Instead, I simply placed the cake box on their granite countertop, my 3-layered declaration of love landing with a soft thud that seemed to echo through their perfect kitchen, turned around and walked back through the door I'd entered with such hope just moments before. "Mom," Vivian called after me, her voice high and desperate. "Mom, wait." But I was already moving, my arthritic legs carrying me faster than they should have been able, back to my car, back to the highway that had brought me here, away from the truth that had just shattered everything I thought I knew about my place in my daughter's life. "Evie, please." Sterling's voice joined the chorus of my name. "We didn't mean—" I closed the car door on their excuses, turned the key in the ignition with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Strange how clarity can arrive in the moment when everything falls apart. The windshield wipers resumed their metronomic rhythm: left, right, truth, lies, love, indifference, as I pulled away from the curb where my old life had just ended. In my rearview mirror, I could see them standing in the driveway despite the rain. Vivian's arms wrapped around herself, Sterling's hand on her shoulder. They looked small and insignificant, dwindling as I drove away, becoming nothing more than two figures in a tableau of consequences they hadn't expected to face. I didn't look back again. The rain seemed to intensify as I reached the highway, as if nature itself were providing cover for my retreat. My clothes still clung to my skin, cold and uncomfortable, but the physical discomfort seemed distant, secondary to the hollow expanding in my chest where 50 years of maternal devotion used to live. My phone began to buzz in my purse once, twice, then continuously as texts and calls poured in. I didn't need to check the screen to know it was Vivian, frantically trying to repair what couldn't be fixed, to explain away what couldn't be explained. I switched the phone to silent without looking, then pulled over at the next exit and dropped it into a trash can at a gas station. Some conversations aren't worth having. Where does one go when home has been revealed as an illusion? When the love you've counted on proves conditional? When the relationship you've nurtured reveals itself as nothing more than obligation, managed through guilt and financial dependence? The highway stretched before me like a question I wasn't ready to answer, offering countless destinations, none of them leading back to the woman who had believed just hours before that she was driving toward joy. That night, as I sat in a roadside motel room that smelled of disinfectant and decades of other people's disappointments, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. This wasn't just about cruel words spoken in a moment of frustration. This was the culmination of years of subtle dismissals, of increasingly transparent excuses, of a relationship that had been wilting while I continued to water it with hope. My daughter hadn't simply rejected my surprise visit. She had rejected my place in her life entirely, wished for my death as a solution to the inconvenience of my love. And tomorrow, I would have to decide what to do with that truth. 3 days in that roadside motel gave me something I hadn't experienced in years: solitude without loneliness. No phone calls to answer, no appearances to maintain, no exhausting effort to pretend that everything was fine when my world had just collapsed around me. I bought new clothes at a nearby mall, practical items that reflected who I was becoming rather than who I'd been trying to be. No more floral dresses that Vivian always suggested would brighten my look. No more pastels chosen to make myself appear harmless and unthreatening. I selected navy slacks, crisp white blouses, and a charcoal wool coat that made me feel substantial, serious, worthy of respect. I kept my phone silenced except for calls from Beatrice, who provided daily updates on my house and my cat, Mr. Pemberton, while carefully avoiding any mention of the frantic visitors who'd been pounding on my door. "You know they came by, don't you?" Beatrice said during our nightly call on the third evening. "Vivian and Sterling knocking on your door first, then mine when they realized you weren't home. What did you tell them?" I asked, sipping the hotel coffee that tasted like dishwater but somehow felt appropriate for this transitional moment in my life. "That you were safe and would contact them when you were ready." Sterling tried that charm offensive he's so fond of, you know, that practiced smile and concerned voice. I told him I might be old, but I'm not stupid. On my fourth morning away from everything familiar, I made the phone call that would change everything. My hands were steadier than they'd been in days as I dialed my bank. "First National, how may I help you?" "I'd like information about accounts where I'm listed as a guarantor," I said, after verifying my identity with the customer service representative. There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Do you mean joint accounts, Mrs. Harrington?" "No," I replied with growing certainty. "Accounts where I've provided financial backing, credit cards, loans, anything where my assets are being used as security for someone else's debt." What followed was a revelation more painful than overhearing Vivian's cruel words. The representative's voice grew increasingly uncomfortable as she read through the list, 4 credit cards with combined limits totaling $78,000, all guaranteed by my signature, a personal loan for $35,000 taken out 18 months ago, a home equity line of credit on their house that I'd somehow co-signed without fully understanding the implications. "And when were these arrangements made?" I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling that had started in my chest and was working its way outward. "The oldest credit account was opened 7 years ago, Mrs. Harrington. The most recent was, let me see, 6 months ago." 6 months ago. I remembered that period clearly. Vivian had called me crying about Sterling's business struggles, about how they were barely keeping their heads above water financially. I'd offered to send money, and she'd refused with what I'd thought was admirable pride. "We don't need charity, Mom," she'd said. "Just some moral support and maybe a prayer or two." What she'd meant, I now understood, was that my signature was more valuable than my sympathy. After the bank, I called Jasper's old investment advisor, a man named Frederick Ashworth, who'd guided our financial decisions for nearly 20 years. "Mrs. Harrington, what a pleasure to hear from you. It's been, 5 years since we last spoke?" "Something like that." "Frederick, I need a complete accounting of my assets. Everything Jasper left, everything I've acquired since. Can you email me a summary?" "Of course. Is everything all right? You sound different." "I'm beginning to see things more clearly," I replied, perhaps for the first time in years. The summary arrived that afternoon, and the numbers made my breath catch. The colonial house on Elm Street, now worth nearly 4 times what Jasper and I had paid for it. His life insurance, which I'd invested rather than spent, had grown substantially. My teacher's pension, combined with Social Security and our careful stock investments, created a portfolio worth just over $2 million. $2 million. Almost exactly the amount that Vivian and Sterling had been saving for their dream beach house in Rhode Island, the same beach house they'd mentioned in casual conversation while simultaneously claiming they couldn't afford plane tickets to visit me for Christmas. That evening, I made one more call, this one to Sterling's mother, Constance, with whom I'd maintained a polite but distant relationship over the years. "Evie, how lovely to hear from you. Are you calling about the beach house? I know Vivian is absolutely thrilled about finally closing next month." "The beach house," I repeated carefully, keeping my voice neutral. "Yes, tell me about that." "Well, you know how it is the loan from Montgomery and me really helped make it happen. Though I understand you're contributing significantly as well. It's wonderful that the whole family can come together to help the young ones achieve their dreams. I wasn't contributing, at least not knowingly, but I was beginning to understand exactly what role my financial stability played in their dreams. "Constance," I said gently, "I think there may have been some miscommunication. Could you tell me exactly what Vivian and Sterling told you about my involvement?" The silence that followed was telling. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, become more cautious. "They said you were providing half the down payment. That's why Montgomery and I agreed to loan them the other half. We assumed, well, we thought it was a family investment." After hanging up, I sat in that anonymous hotel room surrounded by printouts and bank statements, constructing a timeline of financial and emotional manipulation so methodical it could only have been deliberate. Each withdrawal from my emotional bank account corresponded perfectly with a withdrawal from my financial one. Each canceled visit coincided with a new request for backing. Each dismissal of my place in their lives was accompanied by an expansion of my place in their financial planning. I thought of Jasper, how carefully he'd built our security, how proud he'd been to leave me well provided for. "Take care of Vivian," he'd said during those final days when cancer was eating him alive. "But don't let her take advantage of your generous heart." Even then, dying and medicated, he'd seen what I'd refused to acknowledge. The next morning, I called the most formidable person I knew, Patricia Whitmore, my bridge partner for 15 years and the most ruthless estate attorney in 3 counties. If you needed someone to navigate complex family finances and wasn't afraid to make enemies in the process, Patricia was your woman. "I need to see you," I said when she answered her phone with characteristic briskness. "Is this about Vivian?" she asked without preamble. Patricia had always been perceptive about family dynamics, probably from years of helping wealthy families tear each other apart over inheritances. "Yes, and about my will, and about learning to stop being a doormat." "About damn time," she replied with obvious satisfaction. "My office, Thursday at 10, and Evie, bring everything, bank statements, loan documents, anything with your signature on it. We're going to fix this properly." Patricia's office featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor and furniture too uncomfortable for lingering, much like Patricia herself. Everything about the space discouraged weakness or indecision. At 72, she still wore her silver hair in a severe chignon and shoes that added 3 inches to her already imposing height. "You look different," she said, instead of hello when I walked in. "I am different." She nodded once, gestured to the least uncomfortable chair. "Tell me everything." I did. Everything from the 9-hour drive through the storm to the overheard conversation to my recent financial discoveries. Patricia took notes without interrupting, her expression unchanging even at the most painful details. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with something that might have been approval. "And now?" she asked. Now I want to change my will, all of it, and I need advice on removing my financial support without exposing myself to legal liability. Patricia's smile was brief but genuine. I've been waiting years for you to say those words. Let's start with the will. For 3 hours, we systematically reconstructed my estate plan, the house on Elm Street, the investment portfolio. All financial assets would go to the Millfield Women's Shelter, where I'd volunteered sporadically over the years and had seen firsthand how money could either trap women or set them free. My personal belongings would be distributed among friends who'd shown genuine care. Beatrice would get my mother's china. My book club would receive my library. The bridge ladies would split my jewelry. And for Vivian, Patricia asked, pen poised. I thought carefully before answering. My recipe collection and my diaries. Let her read about the mother she dismissed and the life she never bothered to value. Deliciously petty, Patricia observed with obvious approval. I like it. Next came the more complex task of financial disentanglement. Patricia brought in her partner, who specialized in banking law, and together we crafted formal letters removing my guarantees from all of Vivian and Sterling's credit accounts, effective immediately. We notified their mortgage company that I was rescinding my secondary guarantee on their home loan. We closed joint accounts I'd forgotten existed and opened new ones solely in my name. They'll feel this within days. Patricia's partner warned, as I signed form after form, credit limits will be reduced, possibly to 0. Loan terms may need to be renegotiated. I understand, I said, my signature growing more confident with each document. The beach house closing will almost certainly fall through without your financial backing, Patricia added, watching my face carefully for any sign of wavering resolve. I thought of Vivian's voice. God, I hope she crashes. I thought of their laughter, the casual cruelty of people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. So be it, I replied. Before leaving Patricia's office, I made one final decision. I called Constance Richards again. Constance, I wanted to let you know that I've removed my financial guarantees from Vivian and Sterling's accounts. I said without preamble. I don't understand, she replied, confusion evident in her voice. What guarantees, the ones they've been using to secure credit and loans, including, I suspect, the financing for the beach house? I thought you should know before the closing, since they apparently told you I was contributing half the down payment. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight with understanding. Evie, they told us you were contributing $40,000 toward the down payment. That's the only reason Montgomery and I agreed to loan them the other $40,000. Well, I said with surprising calm, I'm not, and I won't be. I thought you deserved to know the truth before you find out from your bank. That evening, I felt neither triumph nor guilt, just a strange, clear certainty that I had finally stopped enabling people who wished me dead. I ordered room service, a small luxury I rarely allowed myself, and ate while watching the sunset over the town where I'd made the most important decisions of my late-in-life independence. My phone buzzed intermittently throughout the evening with calls from numbers I didn't recognize Sterling, trying different phones to reach me. No doubt. Finally, around 9 o'clock, I answered one. What have you done? Sterling's voice was tight with panic rather than concern. Hello, Sterling. I'm quite well. Thank you for asking. The bank called. All our credit cards, they're saying the accounts are being restructured because you've removed your guarantee. The mortgage company, too. And Constance called about the beach house. Yes, I spoke with her. Interesting that you told your parents I was contributing to the down payment when we'd never discussed such a thing. It was a misunderstanding, he said quickly. Look, we need to talk about this, about whatever you think you heard that day. I know exactly what I heard, I interrupted, and what I've learned since makes it clear it wasn't a momentary lapse of judgment, but a pattern of manipulation that's been going on for years. Evie, please, we can explain. No more. Sterling, no more manipulations, no more guarantees, no more financing a life that excludes me except when my credit score is needed. I hung up and blocked his number, then turned off my phone entirely. Some conversations aren't worth having, and some relationships aren't worth saving. Tomorrow. I would drive home to Millfield and begin building a life that didn't revolve around people who found my existence inconvenient. At 78, I had finally learned that love without respect isn't love at all, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and others is to stop pretending that cruel words spoken in comfortable kitchens don't reveal the truth about where you actually stand in someone's life. Home felt different when I returned to Millfield. The familiar rooms of my colonial house held the same furniture, the same photographs, the same view of the maple tree Jasper had planted when Vivian was born. But I moved through these spaces as someone entirely new, a woman who had finally recognized her own worth and refused to accept anything less than genuine respect. Mr. Pemberton, my orange tabby, greeted me with his usual feline indifference, then spent the entire evening planted firmly on my lap, as if to ensure I wouldn't disappear again. Beatrice brought over the promised bottle of Glenfiddich that Jasper had given her years ago, and we sat on my back porch as twilight settled over the garden I'd neglected while chasing the affection of people who found my existence burdensome. They've been calling me daily, Beatrice said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass with obvious satisfaction. Vivian sounds less worried and more angry now. I suspect the financial notifications have started arriving. They have, I replied, taking a small sip of the scotch that burned pleasantly down my throat. I've been quite thorough. Beatrice's eyebrows rose with interest. Define thorough. I told her everything: the changed will, the removed guarantees, the beach house revelation that had exposed years of calculated deception. When I finished, Beatrice raised her glass in a silent toast that said more than words ever could. Jasper would be proud, she said simply, and those 4 words meant more to me than any apology Vivian might eventually offer. The first letter arrived 3 days after my return, delivered on thick cream stationery that Vivian had probably purchased specifically for this crisis management. The handwriting was precise, formal, in a way our relationship had never been the penmanship of someone trying to control a situation that had spiraled far beyond their expectations. Dear Mom, I don't know what's happening or why you won't answer our calls. The bank says our credit limit has been drastically reduced because you're no longer serving as our guarantor. Sterling's mother called asking about the loan we took from them last year, saying you contacted her with questions about our arrangement. Whatever you think you heard that day, you misunderstood the situation completely. We were joking around after a stressful week. You know how Sterling and I sometimes use dark humor to cope with pressure. Please call us immediately. We're genuinely worried about your well-being. Love, Vivian. No apology. No acknowledgement of the cruelty I'd witnessed. Just gaslighting, wrapped in maternal concern and financial panic disguised as filial worry. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box where I kept Vivian's childhood drawings and school reports, adding this final piece of evidence to the archive of our relationship's evolution from authentic love to calculated manipulation. That evening, Sterling called from yet another new number, having apparently exhausted his supply of phones I hadn't already blocked. "The beach house closing is next Friday," he said, without any greeting or pretense of caring about my well-being. "The sellers won't extend the deadline again. We need you to reinstate the financial guarantee by Monday morning, or we'll lose everything." "Hello, Sterling," I replied with deliberate politeness. "I'm afraid that won't be possible." "Evie, be reasonable. This is our dream home. We've been working toward this for years, planning every detail." "Interesting," I interrupted. "During those same years, you told me repeatedly that you couldn't afford plane tickets to visit for Christmas because travel during the holidays was so expensive." Silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of his calculations about how to respond to my newfound clarity. "That was different," he finally said. "Travel expenses and real estate investments aren't the same thing." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "A $2.5 million beach house isn't the same as a $400 plane ticket. One represents a luxury you can't afford, while the other represents basic respect for family relationships. Goodbye, Sterling." I hung up before he could respond, feeling neither satisfaction nor remorse, just the quiet certainty that I was finally standing on solid ground instead of the shifting sand of other people's expectations. The consequences of my actions unfolded like dominoes falling in precisely the pattern I'd intended. Daily letters from Vivian grew increasingly desperate. Each one focused more on financial urgency and less on any pretense of repairing our relationship. Voice messages from Sterling alternated between manipulative charm and barely veiled accusations of vindictive behavior. Even calls from their friends began arriving, people I'd met briefly at functions where I'd been introduced as Vivian's mom rather than by my own name, suddenly concerned about my mental health and well-being. Their mortgage company sent formal letters to my home address requesting verification of my withdrawal as secondary guarantor. Credit card companies did the same. Each day brought fresh confirmation of how thoroughly they had entangled me in their financial planning without my informed consent, and how quickly their carefully constructed lifestyle was crumbling without my unwitting support. The beach house closing failed spectacularly. Through Constance, with whom I now had coffee monthly, I learned that Vivian and Sterling had been forced to forfeit their down payment and face potential legal action from the sellers. They'd also had to downsize from their Tudor-style home to a modest ranch house, unable to maintain the mortgage payments without my financial backing. Sterling had taken a second job delivering packages in the evenings. Vivian had started selling real estate work she'd once dismissed as beneath someone with my education level. I took no pleasure in their struggles, but I recognized their necessity. For too long, I had protected them from the natural consequences of their choices, enabling a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford while being treated as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be valued. 6 weeks after that rainy drive to Connecticut, I hosted my 79th birthday party in the garden behind my Millfield home. Not the elaborate celebration Vivian had always pushed for, "You should rent the country club," "Mom, make it really special," but something genuinely reflective of who I was becoming rather than who I'd been pretending to be. Beatrice came with her infamous potato salad that was somehow both terrible and beloved. Patricia arrived, wearing a dress the color of flame that could be seen from 3 houses away. My bridge club attended en masse, along with my book group and the women I'd volunteered with at the library, people who had been relegated to the periphery of my life, while I'd centered those who valued me least. Most surprisingly, Zoe Hamilton came Vivian's best friend since college, who had chosen our honest relationship over decades of loyalty to someone who demanded she ignore obvious cruelty. She tried to make me choose sides, Zoe admitted as we arranged cucumber sandwiches on my mother's silver platters that I'd finally decided were worth using. Said I was betraying 20 years of friendship by coming to your party instead of supporting her during this difficult time. And yet, here you are, I observed. Here I am, she agreed. It turns out loyalty has limits, especially when someone expects you to participate in gaslighting a woman who's only ever shown kindness. We ate carrot cake, not the recipe I'd left on Vivian's counter that rainy day, but a new creation with crystallized ginger and orange zest that reflected my evolution rather than my history. I served it on my good china, the set I'd been saving for special occasions that had never seemed important enough to warrant their use. Patricia raised her wine glass as the evening light turned golden across my lawn. To Evie, she announced, who at 79 has more courage than most people half her age. To new beginnings, Beatrice added, and to finally knowing your own worth. I looked around at these faces, some known for decades, others more recent additions to my life, and felt something expand in my chest that I barely recognized as genuine happiness. This was family, chosen and authentic, rather than obligated and conditional. This was connection based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. The consequences for Vivian and Sterling continued to unfold throughout the autumn. Their credit cards were canceled entirely when they couldn't meet the new payment terms without my guarantee. Sterling's business, apparently more dependent on borrowed money than actual revenue, began to struggle significantly. They were forced to sell Vivian's jewelry collection pieces I'd given her over the years for birthdays and holidays just to meet basic expenses. Through the intricate social network that exists in small towns, I learned that their marriage was showing signs of strain. Arguments in grocery store parking lots, tense encounters at the bank. Sterling had been seen at Murphy's Tavern far too often, drinking alone while Vivian worked late showings, trying to generate enough commission to keep them afloat. I felt neither vindication nor guilt about their struggles. What I felt was something more profound, freedom. Freedom from the exhausting effort of trying to earn love from people who saw affection as a transaction. Freedom from the constant anxiety about whether my next phone call would be welcome. Freedom from monitoring my own behavior to ensure I wasn't being too needy or too much for people who should have wanted me in their lives without conditions. In November, as the first snow dusted the maple tree Jasper had planted, I received unexpected news. Zoe called with information she thought I should hear directly rather than through the town gossip network. Vivian is pregnant, she said without preamble. About 4 months along. I thought you should know, especially since she's been telling people that the stress of your financial manipulation might affect the baby. I sat with this information for several days, emotions tangling like yarn I couldn't unravel. A grandchild, something I'd hoped for but stopped expecting as Vivian approached 50. A new person who would exist beyond the complications of our damaged relationship. A life coming into being even as others were being fundamentally restructured. After careful consideration, I sent Vivian a card on my finest stationery, not a text or email, but a proper card that conveyed the gravity of what I wanted to communicate. Dear Vivian, I've heard about your pregnancy. Congratulations on this blessing. A child changes everything, sometimes by their presence, sometimes by their absence. I hope this baby brings you the wisdom to recognize what truly matters and the courage to build relationships based on love rather than utility. If you ever want to discuss rebuilding our connection based on mutual respect rather than financial entanglement, my door remains open. The child you're carrying deserves to know a grandmother who is valued, not merely tolerated. With hope for all our futures. Mother. She didn't respond immediately, but I hadn't expected her to. Some seeds take months or even years to germinate, if they grow at all. What mattered was that I had offered truth instead of pretense, authentic possibility instead of desperate accommodation. As winter settled over Millfield, I began volunteering regularly at the women's shelter that would inherit my estate. Many of the residents were roughly Vivian's age, women rebuilding their lives after relationships that had diminished rather than enhanced their sense of worth. In their stories of manipulation and gaslighting, I recognized echoes of my own experience, different in degree, but not in kind. You don't seem like most of the older volunteers, one young woman told me as we worked on her job applications. You understand how someone can love you and hurt you at the same time? I've had some recent experience with that particular contradiction, I replied. When the shelter director learned about my estate planning, she insisted on taking me to lunch at the nicest restaurant in town. That's quite a legacy gift, Mrs. Harrington. May I ask what inspired such generosity? I told her about Vivian, about the overheard conversation, about realizing how thoroughly I'd been used and dismissed. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair with understanding in her eyes. So, this is about punishing your daughter, she asked without judgment, merely seeking clarity. No, I said after careful consideration. This is about honoring what matters. These women are doing the hard work of rebuilding their lives with dignity and courage. My money should go toward fostering strength and independence, not enabling entitlement and exploitation. At 79, I had finally learned that consequences aren't the same as revenge. They're simply the natural result of choices. Delayed justice for those who'd been protected too long from the reality of their actions. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is stop shielding people from the truth about themselves. 6 months after leaving that carrot cake on Vivian's counter, I was in my kitchen making a grocery list for Thanksgiving dinner when my phone rang with an unfamiliar Hartford number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd grown cautious about unknown calls, having learned that desperation makes people remarkably creative about finding new ways to reach you. But something made me answer on the 4th ring. Mrs. Harrington, this is Dr. Martinez from Hartford Memorial Hospital. I have your daughter Vivienne here, and she's asked me to call you. My heart stuttered. That instinctive maternal panic that no amount of hurt can entirely erase. Is she all right? She's stable, the doctor assured me quickly. She experienced some bleeding earlier today and was concerned about her pregnancy. We've run tests and everything looks normal, but we're keeping her overnight for observation as a precaution. Her husband is traveling for work, and she specifically asked if I would contact you. Thank you for calling, I said, already mentally calculating the drive time to Hartford. Please tell her I'll be there as soon as I can. She also asked me to tell you something else. Dr. Martinez continued, his voice softening with the practiced compassion of someone who delivered many difficult messages. She said to tell you she's sorry, but only if you meant what you wrote in your card about being open to rebuilding your relationship. I closed my eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 6 months of silence and stubbornness, both hers and mine. Please tell her I'll be there in 3 hours. The drive to Hartford was nothing like that journey 6 months before. No rain, no cake, no anticipation of joy, followed by devastating heartbreak. Just clear November sunshine and the steady hum of my Honda on Interstate 84, carrying me toward a conversation that was 6 months and 30 years in the making. When I walked into Vivian's hospital room, I barely recognized the woman lying in the narrow bed. The expensive highlights had grown out, revealing gray roots she'd always been so careful to hide. Without her usual makeup and designer clothes, she looked smaller, more vulnerable, more like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms than the polished woman who'd wished for my death in her granite-countered kitchen. Her hand rested protectively over the gentle swell of her abdomen, and when she saw me, tears immediately filled her eyes. Not the manipulative tears I'd grown wary of over the years, but something clearer, more genuine, the kind of crying that comes from a place too deep for calculation. "You came," she said simply, her voice hoarse with emotion. "You asked," I replied, taking the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the beeping of monitors and the distant sounds of hospital life continuing around us. I studied her face, searching for signs of the daughter I'd raised, the child who'd once brought me dandelions as if they were roses and declared them the most beautiful flowers in the world because they're everywhere and free. "I've been seeing a therapist," Vivian said finally, her eyes fixed on her hands rather than my face. "Ever since we lost the beach house. At first, it was just to deal with the financial stress, but it's become something much more complicated than that." I waited, allowing her the space to continue at her own pace. One thing I'd learned during these months of solitude was the power of silence, of not rushing to fill uncomfortable pauses with reassurances or questions. She asked me things no one's ever asked before, Vivian continued, about why I resented your phone calls so much, why I felt obligation instead of connection when we talked, why I could say such cruel things about someone who had only ever shown me love and support. Her voice broke on the last words, and she finally looked up to meet my eyes. I didn't have good answers. "Mom, I still don't have complete answers, but I'm beginning to understand that I've been punishing you for years for Dad's death, for being alone when I wanted to feel independent, for needing me when I was trying so hard to build something impressive and separate from my childhood. It wasn't a complete reckoning. Such things take years, not months, but it was a beginning, a small green shoot breaking through ground that had been frozen for longer than either of us wanted to admit. The financial stuff," she continued, her voice getting stronger. "Losing the beach house, having to downsize, Sterling having to take that second job. It's been really hard, harder than I ever imagined." She gave a small, watery laugh. "But my therapist says it's the best thing that could have happened to us, that we were building a life based on appearances and other people's money rather than our own authentic capabilities." "And what do you think?" I asked gently. "I think she's right, and I think you knew that all along, didn't you? That we were living beyond our means, both financially and emotionally." Vivian reached for my hand tentatively, as if testing whether I might pull away. Her skin was warm and soft. familiar in a way that made my chest tighten with memories of all the times I'd held this hand, teaching her to write her name, walking her to kindergarten, comforting her through breakups and disappointments. "I'm not asking for money. Mom," she said quickly, as if reading my thoughts. "I'm not asking for guarantees or loans or any kind of financial support. I'd like to try again, to build something real between us before this baby comes. Something based on who we actually are, rather than who we think we should be." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of possibility and caution in equal measure. "I'd like that too," I said, "but it has to be different this time. No more pretending that cruel words were jokes. No more treating my love as a burden to be managed. No more using my resources without my knowledge or consent." "I know," she whispered. "I know, and I'm so sorry. Not just about what you heard that day, but about everything. About making you feel like your calls were interruptions. About taking your financial support for granted while making you feel unwelcome in our lives. About wishing." She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We didn't solve everything that day in Hartford Memorial. Real healing isn't a moment, but a process, full of setbacks and small victories, misunderstandings and gradual rebuilding. But we made a start, and sometimes that's enough a foundation upon which something stronger can eventually be built. In the months that followed, we established new patterns with the careful attention of people who'd learned that relationships require intentional maintenance. Weekly coffee dates where financial matters were explicitly off limits. Occasional family dinners where conversations went deeper than weather and social pleasantries. A shared baby registry where I could contribute as a grandmother rather than as an unwitting financial backer. Sterling struggled more with the new arrangement. His natural charm had always been a currency that lost value rapidly when it couldn't be exchanged for material benefit, but he was trying, if only for Vivian's sake and the child they were expecting. The financial consequences had humbled him in ways that might, eventually, lead to genuine change. As for me, I maintained the life I'd built during our estrangement. The women's shelter remained the primary beneficiary in my will, though I added a modest trust for my grandchild's education enough to provide opportunities without creating dependency. My friendships with Beatrice, Patricia, and the other women who'd proven their authentic caring continued to deepen. I kept volunteering at the shelter, tending my garden, taking watercolor classes at the community center. Some might call what I'd done revenge, but I preferred to think of it as consequences. At 79, I'd finally learned that love without respect isn't love at all, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and others is to stop pretending that harmful behavior is acceptable simply because it comes from family. The baby arrived on a warm day in late spring, a little girl with Vivian's dark hair and what the nurses swore was my stubborn chin. When Vivian placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, uncomplicated joy, love without conditions or calculations. "Her name is Hope," Vivian said softly. "Hope Evelyn, after you." I looked down at this tiny person who represented possibility and second chances, and felt tears on my cheeks for the first time since that rainy day when my world had collapsed in a suburban kitchen. "Hello, Hope Evelyn," I whispered. "Your grandmother has been waiting to meet you. The rain falls differently now, not as storms to be endured, but as reminders that even the harshest weather eventually clears, leaving the world washed clean and ready for whatever comes next." The carrot cake I bake these days has less sugar and more spice like me. Perhaps, like the truth that finally set us all free. This morning, as I mixed batter for a new recipe, while Hope gurgled happily in her bouncy seat in my kitchen, my phone chimed with a text from Vivienne. A photo of Sterling reading a bedtime story to their daughter, with the simple message, teaching her about the importance of family, the real kind, built on love and respect. I touched the screen gently, this window into a future I hadn't been sure I'd live to see. Then I returned to my baking, folding in fresh ingredients, creating something that had never existed before, much like the relationships we were slowly, carefully building. One honest conversation, one maintained boundary, one choice at a time. The timer rang. It was time to take the cake out of the oven, time to move forward with eyes open and heart cautious but not closed. Time to accept that some journeys begin, not with 9-hour drives through storms, but with the courage to say, I am worth more than this. We all are. At 79, I'd learned that it's never too late to demand the respect you deserve, to choose authentic connection over convenient illusion, and to discover that the strongest love sometimes requires the firmest boundaries. The recipe for a life well lived, it turns out, calls for equal parts forgiveness and accountability, seasoned generously with self-respect and baked until golden with truth. At 80, I watch my granddaughter Hope take her first wobbly steps across my living room floor, her laughter filling spaces that were once haunted by loneliness and regret. The woman who drove 9 hours through a rainstorm 6 months ago would barely recognize the person I've become, not because I'm different, but because I finally remembered who I was before I started shrinking myself to fit into other people's convenience. Vivienne and I meet for coffee every Tuesday now. Conversations that flow naturally rather than being managed around unspoken resentments. Sterling has started therapy too, slowly learning that relationships require investment beyond financial calculations. We're not the family we were before we're better, built on truth instead of obligation, respect instead of manipulation, authentic love instead of convenient arrangements. The women's shelter thrives with its new endowment, helping other women discover their worth and rebuild their lives with dignity. Beatrice and I still share evening scotch and morning gossip over our garden fence. Patricia continues terrorizing opposing counsel while being one of my dearest friends. My bridge club knows they can count on me for terrible jokes and excellent desserts. Some people say I was too harsh. That family should forgive anything. But I've learned that forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's enablement. The kindest thing I ever did for Vivienne was to stop protecting her from the consequences of treating me poorly. Love sometimes requires boundaries sharp enough to cut through years of accumulated cruelty and wake people up to what they're losing. The rain still falls on my maple tree, but now I watch it from a kitchen where I'm baking recipes I actually want to make, in a house filled with people who value my presence, living a life that honors both my generous heart and my hard-won wisdom. We live in a world that tells us to endure, to forgive endlessly, to maintain relationships at any cost. But what if the cost is your own soul? What if keeping peace means accepting cruelty? What if staying connected requires surrendering your dignity? Evie's story teaches us that self-respect isn't selfish, it's essential. At 78, she discovered what many of us spend our entire lives learning, that love without respect is just manipulation, wearing a prettier name. Her daughter's wish for her death wasn't a momentary lapse. It was the culmination of years of taking maternal love for granted while treating the giver as inconvenient. The most profound transformation wasn't in Evie's bank account, or it was in her willingness to say, "I deserve better," and mean it. She didn't seek revenge. She simply stopped enabling behavior that harmed her spirit. By refusing to be a doormat, she forced everyone around her to either step up or step away. True family doesn't mean tolerating abuse because of shared DNA. It means choosing people who choose you back, who celebrate your existence rather than merely tolerate it. Sometimes the family we create through boundaries and self-respect is stronger than the one we inherited through biology. At any age, 29, 59, or 79, you have the right to demand the respect you deserve. It's never too late to stop being someone's financial safety net and emotional scapegoat. It's never too late to choose dignity over desperation. Share this story if you've ever had to choose between peace and self-respect. Tell us in the comments, at what age did you finally learn to value yourself? What would you have done in Evie's situation? Subscribe for more stories about the quiet courage it takes to honor your own worth, because every one of us deserves to be valued, not just tolerated.